Muted. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the World History Association's seventh Under the Baobab session. This is Conversations and Community in World History. Thank you so much for joining us. As people have been coming into the room, I'm seeing some familiar faces, other WHA members and people who've been at previous meetings and lots of new folks. So very happy to have you all joining us here under the Baobab. I'm Laura Mitchell, and I'm the president of the World History Association. It's an honor to have you here in this space and to be a part of the vibrant intellectual community that's finding new ways to work during an unprecedented global pandemic. Months and months and months after we started this, I can't believe we're still doing it, but I'm glad that we are. We are trying to create here a vibrant intellectual community that is working through this unprecedented pandemic and historic protest in the US and around the world. I'm speaking to you from Irvine, California, which is located on the homelands of the Achachimen and Tongva peoples. This series of online gatherings started as part of the WHA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the groundswell of anti-racist activism that started in 2020. It's developed into an ongoing series, a place where we can talk about research, teaching, and social justice. Today's gathering has the added attraction of being part of the American Historical Association's ongoing virtual annual meeting. The conversation that we'll hear today was originally conceived as a WHA-sponsored panel at the AHA's 2021 meeting that, as we all know, had to be canceled. Before we dive into content, a bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphone muted during the plenary session to minimize background noise. Feel free, though, to use the chat function to connect with colleagues and to answer questions of the meeting hosts. If you're on a computer, you can activate the chat function using the icon in the middle of the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're on a tablet or smartphone, you'll need to use that button with an ellipsis, the 3 dots, to see the chat option. Now I want to turn the floor over to Trevor Getz, who's a stalwart member of the WHA, a frequent participant in Under the Baobab, and a newly installed WHA Council member. Trevor is a leading voice in world history scholarship and education, blazing trails with K-12 teachers at the OER project, working intently on improving teaching and learning in college-level introductory courses, which Trevor knows I refuse to call the survey, but that's a conversation he and I will pick up someplace else. He's doing that work with the H21 project, and he's the author of numerous books, including Abina and the Important Men. He is a professor of history at San Francisco State University. Trevor, over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I didn't actually know I was going to get an introduction because I'm the moderator today, and I'm the moderator of 4 incredible panelists. And you're going to hear me say something only for about 30 seconds before I start to introduce our panelists. Because what I want to say is that everyone here teaches world history in some way or another. I see people at research institutions and community colleges, and I know that there's some high school teachers in here from whom I have learned a lot over the years, particular individuals. So this is part of an ongoing conversation in which we want you to participate, to renew and reinvigorate the first-year world history course, the world history course at the high school level as well, to make it meaningful and relevant for today's students. Our 4 scholar teachers today are each going to talk for 8 to 10 minutes to give you a perspective from post-colonial history and urban history, from big history, from local history and migration studies, about how we can teach and assess students in the survey. So their job is to start the conversation, and then hopefully you will be able to all participate in the conversation, and I'm going to try to help moderate that as much as possible. Let me just introduce our 4 panelists and then sort of let them go to cry havoc and let slip the scholars, as it were. So our first, we will hear from Mike Vann, a professor of world history at CSU Sacramento, a native of Honolulu, Hawaii. Vann earned his doctorate at UC Santa Cruz under the supervision of Tyler Stovall. He specializes in French colonial empire, Southeast Asia, and the Cold War. Just to editorialize his incredible book, The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, Empire, Disease, and Modernity in French Colonial Vietnam, is part of the Oxford University Press Graphic History series. He's received multiple Fulbright awards. He's always in France or Cambodia or Indonesia teaching, which is fascinating. was president of the French Colonial Historical Society and vice president of the California World History Association. He's also the host of New Books on History, a channel of the New Books Network. And his current research, by the way, looks at Cold War era mass violence in Southeast Asia. Our second presenter, and in many ways our leader here, is Alyssa Goldstein Steppenwall, who did so much organizing work to work with Carrie and the WHA folks, and also the AHA folks who are going to be carrying this recording. Alyssa is a professor at California State University San Marcos, where she is the past winner of the Harry E. Brakebill Outstanding Professor Award and the President's Award for Innovation in Teaching. Professor Steppenwall earned her PhD in history from Stanford. She teaches courses in world, Haitian, French, and French colonial and Jewish history. Her newest book, which is really about how the past is used, is Slave Revolt on Screen, The Haitian Revolution in Film and Video Games. It's coming out from the University Press of Mississippi this June. Her past works include The Abbé Grégoire and the French Revolution, The Making of Modern Universalism, and Haitian History, New Perspectives. Our third presenter will be Tony Acevedo, who is an assistant professor of history and the program coordinator at Hudson County Community Colleges in Jersey City, New Jersey. He teaches the history of Western civilization, including honor seminars, US history, and Latin American history. Outside of the university, he was an NEH Summer Scholar in Europe and a Metro City Fellow at Teachers College, Columbia University, where he developed pedagogical projects to improve general and liberal education curricula at at high diversity colleges and universities. He was recently awarded the Dale Parnell Distinguished Faculty Recognition by the American Association of Community Colleges. And our final presenter and an old friend, Mark Jason Gilbert, who received his PhD from UCLA and for many years was professor of history and co-director of programs in South and Southeast Asia in the University System of Georgia. Since 2006, he has been the holder of the NEH-supported Endowed Chair in World History at Hawaii Pacific. Since 2008, he's been the editor of a journal we all know well, The World History Connected, which reaches 1.85 million readers and 6 million visitors to the website. He served as president of the World History Association and of the Southeastern Regional Association of Asian Studies. He conducted world history workshops at every level of introduction in the US, Europe, and Asia, including the foundational NEH teacher training workshops of 1999 to 2000. He's currently deeply involved in more teacher training workshops in world history and related curricular revisions in his home state of Hawaii. Most of you know he's the author of, one of the authors of World Civilizations, The Global Experience, now in 8th edition. And he's recently published South Asia and World History with Oxford University Press and with John Davidan, Cross-Cultural Encounters in the Modern World History, 1453 to the present. So we have a range of all distinguished scholars with different backgrounds to start our conversation. Please keep notes as they speak because really we want to open things up to you afterwards. But our first speaker we turn to Michael Vann. So I will turn my sound off and you can turn yours on.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Trevor. Thank you to the WHA for hosting us. Thank you to the AHA, and thank you to all of you for logging in. I was told not to address anybody by name because it sounds clubby, but I'm so happy to see so many familiar faces here. This is really wonderful. So many undergraduates complain that they feel lost in world history survey courses, and it's our own damn fault. Between the plethora of unfamiliar names and exotic locations that we throw at them, and our field's macro-analytic world systems perspective, students, especially non-history majors, can feel overwhelmed. In contrast to traditional courses framed by nation-state parameters, world history courses can feel rootless. However, carefully selected urban history case studies can give our students some grounding. Looking at world history from the perspective of cities such as Malacca, Potosi, or Kilwa can provide students with a sense of place and a certain degree of familiarity to discuss economic world systems and global flows of commodities, labor, and disease. Drawing from the example of Janet Obalu-Gold's Before European Hegemony, I'm going to offer some strategies for using urban history in world history surveys. So to start off with John Abdul-Gold's now classic 1989 book, indeed, I think this is where many of us became world historians. This is a classic book, and despite various critiques, I'm still a huge fan, and I even start my MA seminars with the book every year, a historiography of world history. Many of us see the book as an excellent model for how to use world systems approach to make sense of the World History Survey. Abdul-Gold's writing is much more user-friendly, read concise, than say Wallerstein or even Andre Gunderfrank. And how many of us use her famous maps in our PowerPoint decks? This is possibly the most plagiarized map in all of world history, right? However, I think many of us can get caught up in the fascinating global networks that the book offers that lead to a hyper macro framing of world history narratives that loses sight of people and places. As much as I love Andre Gunderfrank's Reorient, which much as I love that book, every time I've taught it, students rebel against it. Not just because he argues with himself in his footnotes, which I find absolutely endearing, but because it is a history without people, according to many of my students. Likewise, Kenneth Pomerantz's absolutely brilliant The Great Divergence poses similar challenges for our undergraduates, especially the non-majors. Their eyes seem to glaze over with what I find to be the fascinating construction of a web of globalization driven by Chinese demand for South American silver, the European obsession with Caribbean sugar, Southeast Asian spices, Chinese teas, and South Asian cottons. Our students need somewhere to stand, a place to be grounded, a home as they approach these larger macro issues. In response to losing my students out there in the wild world of world history, I returned to Before European Hegemony and looked at the ways in which Abdul-Gold grounds her book in a series of places, cities to be more precise. She takes us from Ghent and Bruges to Genoa and Venice, to Basra and Alexandria, to Calicut and Malacca, before leaving us at the end at Hangzhou. I think that because we associate her with world systems, we tend to forget that she was an urban sociologist by training. And for those of you who haven't read either of her books on Cairo or Rabat, pick them up, you're in for a real treat. The success of Before European Hegemony is partially due to the way in which she links a series of nodes of economic focal points in the world system. In Before European Hegemony, we always know where we are, and we can look to other parts of the book in relation to our current location. The abstract discussion of the world system makes sense because she puts us in a concrete place and takes us to other concrete places, which are all cities. Now, another classic world history text is Donald Wright's. This is low budget PowerPoint right here. You just hold up the book. Donald Wright's The World in a Very Small Place in Africa, A History of Globalization in Niamey, the Gambia. In some ways, Wright flips Abdul-Gold's approach, but in other ways, he reinforces it. Wright grounds us in the margins, the periphery of the world system, and uses that perspective to look at the larger macroeconomic structures. He shows us how different historical phases of globalization washed up on the sandy shores of a West African riverbank. But we, the reader, know where we are and have a fixed perspective looking at the changing world from Naomi. Revisiting Wright and Abdul-Gold got me to thinking about how to restructure my world history survey courses. I realized a couple of things. First off, I'm an urban historian. My research has mostly been on cities in Southeast Asia, Hanoi, Phnom Penh, Malacca, Jakarta, and Semarang. Why wasn't I working in my urban historical approach to my world survey courses? I guess I initially thought urban history was very unworld history. Urban history is local history, right? But with apologies to John Donne, I came to see that no city is an island, not even Singapore, Mumbai, or Venice. Cities have to exist in larger networks that connect them to their regional hinterlands for food, water, and labor, but also to global networks of long distance trade. Cities are where stuff goes. Cities are where people go. They are the nodes, the transit points, the hinges of the world system. It was when I was writing The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt, shameless self-plug, that I had an epiphany. As the book was to be aimed at a wider audience, not just people interested in Vietnamese history or the huge market of people interested in killing rats, I had to world history it up, as I say. So I began to think more and more about the city as networked within global systems. It also helped that I'd been working with the UC Davis History Project on an innovative module called Sites of Encounter, which essentially applies Janet Abulu-Gold's fusion of world systems and urban history. And then Carl Nightingale recruited me into the Global Urban History Project. At that point, I decided I had to restructure my world history survey by focusing on cities in the world. I still use a standard textbook, the time-tested but steadily updated Traditions and Encounters, but I also use Aaron and Elaine McKinnon's Places of Encounter, a 2-volume anthology of world history essays about various cities. And each of the essays is penned by a different scholar. These essays allow me in the class to link specific details of one city to a larger world system, and then link that on to other cities, other nodes within the world system. By designing writing assignments based on these essays, I require students to engage more abstract global analysis, but with the scaffolding of specific cities. Some of my prompts include contrasting the roles of Malacca and Potosi, or Kilwa, Samarkand, and Venice. Another essay has students link Gore Island with Salvador da Bahia in Brazil. In other essay prompts, I asked them to use St. Petersburg, Paris, and Algiers as examples of, quote, revolutionary cities. And I have an essay prompt that ties London to Shanghai in the 19th century. Again, all of these teaching exercises are grounded, starting in a city and then make the connection out. Foregrounding cities in world history also provokes students to think critically about what a city is and what a city is not. We explore the complicated relationships between cities and nation states. Paris is not France, and France is not Paris. And also ask questions like, how might the colonial elite of Manila have had much more in common with Peninsulares and Creoles in Mexico City or Bogota than they did with the people in the interior of Luzon or the Visayas? How did decisions in London impact the people of southern and eastern China or Greater Bengal? Ironically, having a concrete place to look at the world, a city, allows us to think in a more abstract manner about global connections. I've been really happy with the results of this experiment of blending urban and world history. And from what I've seen in terms of my students' writing, I'm getting much more sophisticated papers that really approach a better understanding of globalization by using this geographic scaffolding. That's my contribution, and I will cede the Zoom mic to my colleague.
Thanks, Mike. And so Alyssa Goldstein Steppenwall.
Great, thank you so much, Trevor. Thank you to the WHA. It's really great to be here on our original WHA sponsored panel for the 2021 AHA. And it's great also to follow my colleague and good friend, Mike Vann. You'll notice some overlap because of some of our common interests. I'm going to talk about one of the innovations I've introduced in my classes in recent years and how it helps deal with the challenge of coverage. There are certainly other things that I do. I also bring in history in film and video games. I could talk about that in the Q&A. But what I'm going to talk about is integrating the local. So the title of my talk is Global Processes, Local Impact, Bringing the World History Survey, or the intro course, as Laura would prefer, home for students. So in the survey, we all share the twin challenges of first, the enormous amount of material that could belong in a history class covering 500 years of history. And then secondly, the remoteness of many of these processes. And that remoteness can be chronological in that the 16th century seems much farther away than the time period a US history class covers. And it can also be geographical, given that many US students have a limited background on other parts of the world. So we have this challenge of coverage, and the pace of a class trying to cover everything can be dizzying. So one way that instructors have dealt with this challenge in the survey is by abandoning coverage for skills and themes. But the skills model has faced numerous critiques, and I think that chronological thinking remains a core component of historical thinking. So I do like to move chronologically and to help students understand causality and contingency. So I want to talk about a different way then that I keep the survey manageable and relevant, not by abandoning a chronological sweep, but by being selective in other ways. And in particular, I try to connect abstract global processes to tangible local issues or people. So first, I'll just tell you a little bit about my course overall, and then I'll tell you about 3 things I've done in my class to connect global processes to local. So my course is the second half of the World History Survey, 1500 to the present. Maybe Mike can use my prop again because it's built around Janet Abulugod's classic, The World System in the 13th century, as well as Alfred Crosby's ideas about the Columbian Exchange. So we explore the rise of Europe by considering contingent factors in the Eastern Hemisphere, as well as the New World. And again, I can show you my full syllabus in the Q&A if anyone would like to see the themes that I've chosen. But the course's beginning certainly could seem remote. 13th century Eurasia can seem boring or irrelevant to Southern California first-year college students, especially first-generation Latinx students who may have had uninspiring K-12 history experiences. They may not have if they had teachers like those of you who are here, but they may have, and who enroll only to fulfill general education requirements. So I try to engage them by linking the global to the local whenever possible. So I'm going to give you these 3 examples. Okay, to illustrate the topic of early modern European colonialism, I don't aim to present every empire. Instead of flying through the Spanish, Portuguese, French, British, Dutch, etc., with a series of meaningless dates and superficial coverage, we focus on one case study, the Spanish. This is important because my university is in San Marcos, and many of the students and I live in San Diego, the former Alta California. Early modern Spanish colonialism is our local history, even if it did not occur to them, and even if they often learn a US history in school that is East Coast centered and British. I also break down abstract topics like the Columbian Exchange into a series of questions they might not have considered before that makes it relevant. Number 1, why do they speak Spanish in Mexico? Many of my students are native Spanish speakers and think of Spanish as indigenous to Mexico versus English being indigenous to the US. Some only realize when I ask that Spanish is not the indigenous language of Mexico at all, but the language of European colonizers who imposed it on their ancestors. Then I ask, why doesn't everyone speak Chinese in Mexico or the US? This helps me get at the fact that there seem to have been oceanic explorers from places other than Europe, like Zhang He. This question makes tangible the fact that the Spanish stayed and imposed their culture in the New World, while any Chinese settlement would have been short-lived and didn't involve a wholesale cultural exchange. And finally, I asked them, again, to think about contingency. Why don't they speak Spanish in China? That helps me get at the question of why the Spanish were successful colonizing here in the New World, but not in the established centers of the Eastern Hemisphere. There, the Spanish did not unleash a deadly epidemic just by showing up, and so they were not able to take over the areas to which they sailed in terms of trading. Overall, I want my students at Cal State San Marcos to understand just how contingent the Spanish takeover of the New World was, and that Europeans were hardly technologically superior to all other societies at the time. So localizing our focus helps. Okay, now I'm going to jump way ahead until the 20th century. Another example, World War II and the Holocaust. These topics seem much more remote to students now than to me growing up decades ago. And each year there are fewer and fewer Holocaust survivors available to speak to students, given that people who had survived a death camp and were still alive in 1945 generally had to be at least 16 then which puts them in their 90s now. But I try to keep tabs in the local community, and if necessary, because of my schedule, I'll send a family member to drive to pick up a survivor. In the 2010s and 2020s, my students often say that they've never heard a Holocaust survivor speak before. So jumping from reading primary sources from the 1930s and 1940s to meeting a person who was alive then really moves my students. It helps concretize for them what can be the murderous consequences of hateful stereotypes. And certainly, again, with so many of my students being Latinx and the demonization of them, that's something that resonates. So even during COVID, having a survivor available to do a Q&A remotely with students was amazing. And finally, I'm also able to help humanize other 20th century processes that might seem abstract, like the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, decolonization, the Vietnam War, climate change, the Iraq War, and to remind students how these abstract processes deeply affect individual lives. So one of my best innovations in recent years was to cut a lecture from the schedule, which would have been the Cold War, and to fold that into other lectures in order to clear one day for a panel called The World Comes to San Diego. I don't have a budget for guest speakers, but I make use of local talent on campus. I invite generally 3 people who came themselves to this country as refugees or immigrants, or whose parents did. So one regular panelist is a staff member in student affairs from Eritrea. He talks about the background of US support for Ethiopia that led to Eritrean national aspirations being thwarted, and why he had to flee to a refugee camp and eventually make his way to San Marcos, where he was one of the first graduates of our university in the early 90s. Another panelist has been a student leader whose parents were refugees from Iraq under Saddam Hussein. That lets her talk about the Ba'ath Party having replaced the regime installed under the British Mandate and how repressive Hussein's government was under the guise of nationalism. I also have one student leader who's the child of Vietnamese refugees, who's told her parents' story, and another whose parents, like so many of my students, came to the US from Mexico, initially without papers. I was not initially sure when I added this if conservative students would be hostile to learning about immigrants and refugees, but I have not received any negative feedback in 3 semesters of doing this. On the contrary, my first generation students, even during COVID, were incredibly engaged and heartened to see their own history and to think of their own families' migration stories, even if it was a few generations back, as part of world history, as a legitimate object of study. So it was well worth cutting a lecture to add this human face to several processes that could have seemed distant. So that has worked for me. But the final thing I want to say is that what works for me in my context is not necessarily what you should do. You live and teach in another context, which might be very different from mine. But I hope this will give you food for thought about things you might do to link the global and your local in your world history introductory class and get students more engaged.
Again, so thank you very, very much, Alyssa. And our next presenter is Tony.
Thank you so much, Trevor. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the AHA for putting this together initially, and then for the WHA for sponsoring it. And to my colleagues, I'm really learning so much from all of you so far, and I'm looking forward to Mark's discussion as well. Let me share my screen here just because I'll go through mine kind of through like a Prezi or PowerPoint situation. And let's just see if this will work here. There we go. So I will be speaking fairly rapidly here just because I was coming right up against 10 minutes when I was rehearsing. So you have to forgive me if I'm going a little bit quickly here. But my discussion is called Thinking Globally in a Western Civ Survey, Challenges and Opportunities. So as a graduate student at San Diego State, I was quite lucky to TA for 2 world history greats in David Christian, trailblazer in big history, and Ross Dunn, the first president-elect of the WHA. I recall the shock and surprise of reading over Professor Christian's world history syllabus and realizing we wouldn't be getting to humans until week 6. But it wasn't long before I fell in love with big history. Spending time with these 2 deeply influenced how I think about the past on a global scale for years to come. So it's rather strange that years later, I find myself teaching many sections not of the World History Survey, but of the Western Civ Survey at Hudson County Community College in Jersey City, where I teach full time and where our campus library overlooks lower Manhattan. The Western Civ Survey has been offered since long before I arrived, and it has been in high demand too, as it fulfills important state gen ed history requirements. And it turns out that offering Western Civ in place of world history wasn't entirely uncommon in my area. Of New Jersey's 18 community colleges, 7 offer only Western Civ. 3 offer only world history, and 7 offer, interestingly, both Western Civ and world history. And 1 offers neither survey, offering specialized courses instead in a variety of content areas. So in New Jersey and across the country, then, there may be many faculty members who find themselves teaching the Western Civ survey, even though they were trained in world history. Are there ways to incorporate world historical thinking into the Western Civ survey? In short, I think there are, though even a modified Western Civ course will never be a world history course. Nevertheless, there are opportunities along the way to incorporate more broad-based and polycentric perspectives. But one major challenge that I found is that the very ideas of both the West and civilization seem to pop out of nowhere in many Western Civ textbooks, taken for granted and not always clearly defined. What exactly is the West, and when did it emerge? One Western Civ textbook begins the first chapter by stating that the origins of Western civilization lie in southern Iraq. Well, when did that part of the world cease being part of the West? Or did it? The same author actually includes Southwest Asia as part of the Greater West. Yet others use no such framework. Another textbook says that civilization, but not specifically Western civilization, emerged in Mesopotamia. And still another states that civilization was, quote, passed on from Mesopotamia and Egypt to the West. And yet one more says that it is the roots of Western civilization that we find in Mesopotamia. So students might be puzzled and might wonder, when was there a crystallization that the West was actually a thing? Did non-Westerners know that they were non-Westerners? And what about the concept of civilization? What has this concept meant throughout history? Even more issues emerge there. To help offer clarity to some of these bewilderments, I usually begin my classes by discussing the emergence of Western Civ as an academic course in the early 20th century and how both the terms Western and civilization have been used in varied and sometimes unsettling ways. In fairness, some Western Civ textbooks do a good job of beginning with similar discussions, but as the examples I've shown reveal, such explanations are too often taken for granted. But another way I've been able to better contextualize the terms Western and civilization has been by doing something that might seem counterintuitive, discussing in more depth that which came before civilization, that is human origins and the Paleolithic era. The most obvious difference between the world history and Western Civ courses is, of course, the geographic distinctions. But besides geography, one of the most important and quite interesting differences between the Western Civ and world history courses is their chronology, their very starting points. To illustrate this point, let's take a look at the differences between Western Civ textbooks in terms of how much space is allotted to human origins and the Paleolithic era. So here you see 9 different Western Civ textbooks that I've kind of selected that have been published over the last few years, and how much space they devote to the pre-agricultural period, right? And basically I started at page 1 and stopped as soon as the terms Neolithic Revolution or Agricultural Revolution came up. So you'll see here 2 pages, 3 pages, 2 pages, 1.5. You get the general sense here. And some of these I quite like as Western Civ textbooks. I currently adopt the Colin Symes book. And I will say that The West, A New History by David Bell and Anthony Grafton has a nice discussion in the preface about the complexities of defining the West and of the term civilization. But overall, you get the sense of how much time is devoted to pre-civilizational history here, right? Compare this with, again, a selection of 9 fairly recently published world history textbooks, and using the same criteria there, and how much space is devoted to the pre-agricultural period here. So you see 26 pages, 20 pages, 34, 26, 31, 34. Even at the low end here of 11 to 12 pages, you have quadruple the space that is devoted in the Western Civ textbooks. So leaping into civilizational history so abruptly in the Western Civ course gives the impression that civilization and the West emerged rather suddenly and permanently near the very beginning. I propose that a more thorough integration of human origins and the Paleolithic era is a feasible way to incorporate a world historical perspective into the Western Civ course. In my classes, students spend an entire week discussing the Paleolithic, its lifeways, migrations, and societies, and they especially seem to enjoy discussions about gender, diet, and how conflict resolution might have taken place on the level of bands of 10 to 50 people. Now, I realize that as this panel is now being hosted by the WHA, I'm speaking about the importance of thinking globally to the proverbial choir here. But I also want to discuss how I used this lesson on this early lesson in my courses on human origins in the Paleolithic as an opportunity to make historical thinking foundational from the outset, specifically focusing on the 5 C's of historical thinking established many years ago now by Thomas Andrews and Flannery Burke. These are change over time, causality, context, complexity, and contingency. So the first thing I do, even before discussing early humans, is have the students watch a couple brief videos. One is a 5-minute lesson from the Minnesota Historical Society that explains the difference between primary and secondary sources, and even quizzes students on the topic. And remember, this is the first college history classes most of the students have taken, and perhaps the only one that they'll take. So a lot of this may be new to them unless they encountered it in high school. So the second video, also brief, is from the National History Education Clearinghouse, teachinghistory.org, and explains that it discusses historical thinking around several important key concepts, such as multiple perspectives, sourcing and analysis of primary materials, and the claim evidence connection. I asked the students what the primary sources would be if someone in the future were to write a history of their lives, and to what extent that future historian would be able to fairly capture their lives. And we start talking about the primary sources discussed in the readings about the Paleolithic era. So the students have now begun the class by thinking hard about what it means to think historically, which is crucial in establishing in week 1 the habits of mind I want them to practice for the rest of the semester. I then try to methodically integrate the 5 C's into the first week's content and lesson on human origins. What changes are we seeing in the Paleolithic era? What caused these changes in both the short term and the long term? What context about these changes is important for us to keep in mind? For this, we can specifically analyze the context around an artifact or a particular aspect of Paleolithic life. In what ways are we seeing human beings become more complex? Complexity works wonderfully in the next week as well, when we begin to discuss the emergence of complex societies or civilizations. And then I discuss contingency. As Alyssa mentioned, the importance of discussing contingency several times. This one, students sometimes struggle to grasp at first, but after I explain that they can think of it as kind of the opposite of inevitability, it starts to make more sense. We then go through contingencies that made possible the changes we discussed in the Paleolithic era, and do the same the next week when discussing agriculture. So discussions about contingency quickly dispel any notion that history somehow simply repeats itself, a popular student maxim in the first few weeks of class. One might also find it useful to put students into different groups where each will be assigned to discuss and then explain one of the 5 C's for that week's topic to the rest of the class. Those teaching the World History 2 survey, let's say starting around 1500 CE, may also find it useful to integrate the 5 C's into early discussions about global convergence and the interactions of the late 15th and early 16th centuries. So I'll just wrap up here by saying that expanding the discussion on human origins and the Paleolithic era in my Western Civ classes has helped me integrate world history while also providing a useful platform to begin discussions about historical thinking. Sometimes we expect students to do history, but might not always discuss what that looks like, especially when any discussions about the methods will take away the limited time we have to focus on all that content that we may feel pressured to cover. But I've noticed that doing so has resulted in fewer confusions in student research papers about what types of sources are required. And in general, I think that gives students the tools to better interpret primary sources on their own. The expanded discussions on the Paleolithic era and the peopling of the earth have also been helpful in reminding students that the world is much bigger, of course, than just the places where our Western Civ content will focus for much of the semester. It also shows them that in the very long view of history, some of the social constructions that seem present since the earliest of times, be it patriarchy or slavery, are in some ways but, quote, recent developments. Finally, it's my hope that in integrating the long view of history into the course, students will be reminded that all that has been made can potentially be unmade. Thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Tony, very much. I just want you all to know I see the stories coming in the questions coming in on the chat, and I'm going to collect them and transmit them. But our last speaker is none other than Mark Jason Gilbert. So Mark, please take it away.
Hi. Well, you know that old line for the magicians say, we've never met before, we've never talked about these things before, and I'm very happy to talk about assessment that will work in terms of integrating the content that we have just brilliantly heard from my colleagues, and use them everything from high school all the way up through undergraduate education. And I have used it in graduate seminars to a certain extent. But the problem is, first we have to look at the problem. And I'm going to keep this talk to about 4 paragraphs, and I'll read them from some notes over here. And the idea is that I pose questions at the end because I can't cover everything. But what I am doing is offering a template that's basically a universal exam style essay that meets all your needs with actually so many more benefits than detriments, let's put it that way. But the most important thing, of course, is the student. And so that's what assessment is about. And I'm going to focus on how students reacted to what is this kind of universal template. And to make it easy, if you just write to me, and I will be very happy to supply you with essentially 6 pages, plus about 7 pages of actual student work, examples of the examination papers, examination instructions, and lead you through what will be some really amazing student results. So the obstacles to improving history survey assessment are fairly familiar to most of us. Coverage concerns, including mile wide and an inch deep. Active learning, that is meeting students' student-based learning needs. Time devoted to assessment, and limited text and resources support. Also, and perhaps above all, is the hard-earned knowledge among instructors that multiple choice and short essay questions are the enemy of critical thinking. But at the same time, they rightly fear that essays create as many problems as they solve. Amongst the most persistent are plagiarism, student pushback against subjective grading, time to complete an assignment, and issues arising from take-home exams, which are actually, as you'll see from this system, are the solution to actually all of our problems in one sense. So that was paragraph number 1. I love saying that. Don't you love it when someone giving a paper says, I have 2 pages left? I always do. 5 years ago, I devised a means that seems to have surmounted these obstacles through successful essay-based assessment strategy. Successful insofar as success is measured by student reviews, the depth of their critical thinking and understanding, no plagiarism cases, and I cut my exam evaluation time by 2/3. Well, this strategy evolves as a response to a necessity. Students now in class write exams by block printing. They stopped teaching cursive in many schools. The result is it takes them about 15 minutes longer to finish their exams. And I watched those 15 minutes increase from the students finished 15 minutes before the end of an hour-and-a-half class, then writing right up to the end of class, and then into the passing period. And I said, well, this is no good. We have to do something better than that. So I eventually devised a means that seems to have surmounted all the obstacles I faced through a successful assessment strategy based on student reviews, university and departmental allocates, which means something for someone facing promotion, no plagiarism cases, as I mentioned, and yet all it really requires is a willingness to suspend disbelief that such a thing can actually be done. And this is what the system delivers, in a sense. Students, upon reading the syllabi for my world history courses, simply do not initially believe that they are going to experience an assessment system that allows them to work independently on an exam whose answers would be based on their own research in a time frame they could easily manage, achieve a grade they know they deserved, and also enable them to improve upon their grade if they wish to do so. After introducing what we're doing, 90% of students did not need the actual experience of an examination as reinforcement, with the remaining 10% admitted that they paid no attention to the samples that I gave them, or even the example provided on the exam paper itself. It doesn't matter how many times you talk about something, but most often students really don't get it. They look at essay exams as hard and beyond their control, and we need to get a way of focusing them on something that they actually like. Okay, I'm going to talk about what we actually do in my class, and then give an example of it. So very concrete example, which actually brings up one of the points Michael Vann made. I think we're close enough. I won't grow a beard, but my mustache is very luxurious. Okay, put simply, I use off-the-shelf take-home essay examination questions suitable for several levels of instruction, whose answers require source analysis, drawn along the lines of not a template, but a sample analytical style of writing that I provide students and that we discuss, and in actual fact, that samples appear on the exam. So when they look at the examination questions, they know exactly what elements must exist in their essay for it to be successful. Well, what are those things? What are the things that we expect in terms of critical thinking? They have to address the issue of why, how, or because. They must utilize the course, they can utilize the course reader, a text, or a pre-existing open source URL databank of sources to illustrate their answer. That's not so difficult, but then they must demonstrate that they understand the meaning of that resource. That's where the why, how, and because can come in, but it's this idea that students can say, the Mongols were really bad. And here's an illustration from a URL of a pile of skulls. But then they must show how that answers the question, why were the Mongols so successful in establishing the greatest empire in human history? Well, I'd say because they employed women, but that's just me and Ani. Okay, anyway, they have to demonstrate what the source meant in terms of the answer to the question. So students actually choose their own examples from readily available sources that are presented to the students, actually from the beginning of the course. Well, the result of this is no test answer is alike. And if it is, you would know what to do. They're all not going to use the same 3 or 4 sources for each essay. It's not possible. And the lovely thing is, it's never happened. I've been using this for 5 years. Not a scintilla of plagiarism has appeared. Now, the result for me was an instant rise in at least one grade step from D and C students, with many more B grades, with no student pushback as to time, no plagiarism, and grading time, as I mentioned, by about 2/3. Actually, with this system, you like reading the essay questions because student research, surprisingly enough, can track down evidence and information and come up with ideas that you may not even have thought of. And the point there is that filters back into your feedback, because I keep a list of resources. I'll talk about that later. But the idea is when students come up with fantastic URL-based information, not, of course, from Wikipedia and not from encyclopedias, we'll talk about later, there's time, but they come up with information that you can put back into the resources that they might use if they choose to do so. And that's kind of exciting. Again, I would teach like 30 students. I don't even know how many days it takes me to grade a 2-essay midterm, but I know I'm actually finished with them in 1 day because I have a template. They must do the things I've just mentioned. And with good instruction, as I mentioned, they don't have any problem writing really good essays. Now, of course, some are more brilliant than others in their insight, in their exemplification. And the nice thing there is you can give those an A, or you can give them a B+, but you have to be able to say why they got a B+ rather than, let's say, an A-. And you can go over a paper with a student without them going, well, that's what I meant. It's either there or it isn't. And anyway, it's never been a problem. Students actually vote to continue using this for the midterm, for example, on the final exam. They're very happy with it. They know it requires a little more work on their part, but it's work that becomes a buy-in. This is their work. They have produced something. It gives them confidence in doing analysis, confidence in something they already really know, which is how you look things up on the internet. I mean, literally, that they do that all the time in places we good. Okay, so the example very quickly, and we're done. Let's say, for example, a question about the causes of the decline of the Roman Empire. All right. Each assertion has to be followed by a statement of why, how, and because, illustrated accordingly, etc. So what's an example? Soil overuse. Why? Because in North Africa, the land in the grain producing areas of North Africa had become, yes, overused. Fewer grain ships. Well, that produced peasants who died of plague, more vulnerable to the plague because their actual immune system were compromised by a shortage of food. This is exactly what Tony was talking about. All these complexities, all these things we've been taught as AP teachers, we know exactly how that particularly works. They can't go to an encyclopedia. I'm finishing up here now, but it really means very little effort to produce very good work. And now my last, even shorter paragraph. As time permits.
We're really out of time, Mark.
Okay, I just say I have some questions already that you can ask me. I hope you've anticipated them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to all of our panelists. These are great presentations. There's so many interesting questions already in the lineup of the chat, and I'm going to try to keep moderating as more come in. But I want to go back to some that were asked earlier to all of you, and anyone can answer. So I want to start with Shane Carter's question and kind of try to put another question together with it. So Shane's question was, for those of you who teach the world or Western Civ or whatever pre-1500, how do you address the dearth of historical work about all of the Americas and most of Africa, Oceania, and Southeast Asia for that period? Do you incorporate archaeology, etc.? And from a different discussion, I wanted to add on that possibly for Tony, is there any danger, Tony, in assigning non-Western areas all this importance pre-civilizational and then just sort of leaving them behind so that they don't appear again as part of the modern, which is more sort of Western Civ? How do you negotiate that problem? So both of those questions on the table. I don't know if anybody.
Yeah, I'll discuss the second one, Trevor. It's something that I've really thought about a lot, actually, and something that I've kind of felt some discomfort over. But then I think the alternative for me, at least, has been like I don't want to just ignore the pre-civilizational stuff. So as I can, I will try to throughout the different parts of the 2 survey courses, try to expand the global thinking as much as possible. And I've found that different points in the courses are really kind of conducive for that. For example, when we talk about like the Columbian exchange, that's another area where the Western Civ textbooks have far less depth of coverage than the world history textbooks. And that's another area where I can really emphasize kind of a wider lens. Same thing when we discuss the new imperialism, and the same thing when we look at industrialization. So I've just tried to find like several key places throughout the course where I can try to, it's really difficult because if you're really assigned to teach Western Civ, it's hard to go completely off script and kind of like go rogue. But I've found several different areas where I can just try to expand the perspective as much as possible. And I think doing so has really allowed me to emphasize contingency. When we get to industrialization, contingency, or when I was TAing for Ross Dunn, like really talking about like coal and colonies and this kind of thing, right? Instead of just being kind of the story of inventions or what have you. This has been really helpful for me. So there's not an easy answer. I'm kind of continuing to find ways to do that better in the future. And the good news is I think that we may shift to world history in the next few years. So we'll see.
Thanks. Mike, you raised your hand that you wanted to respond as well.
I did. Yeah, I just wanted to say just a few quick words about Shane's comment about covering the undersourced areas in the world. I foreground that discussion. I say, hey, the profession does, lack certain sources, textual sources on these areas. Why might that be? And just sort of problematize historical methodology, talk about the need to bring in anthropology. For Africa, one of the things I bring up is the significant sort of disruption of colonial era anthropology on our understanding of Africa. And then for Southeast Asia, I talk about the importance of triangulation, that we don't have textual sources from the literate societies of, say, Srivijaya, because they wrote on palm leaves and they disappeared. So what historians had to do is go into Chinese sources and South Asian and Persian sources and triangulate other sources to do Southeast Asia. And that it opens up an interesting discussion about methodology with the students and takes sort of a bug and turns it into a feature, as they used to say about the old Microsoft system. And then finally, I also really like to emphasize the significance of the wealth of Mali, Mansa Musa, or the wealth of the Khmer Empire in these earlier stages, and contrast that with parts of the world that are now wealthy that were not wealthy at that time. And it gives students a much greater sense of dramatic changes in material conditions over the course of the world, especially as probably in their minds, if they're aware of Mali or in Cambodia, they think of them as very, very poor countries. And it's an eye-opener to look back in this time period where we have difficulty with sources, but look how significant these areas were at one point.
If I can just jump in and add on to Mike, I'll say I haven't taught the first half of the survey now in more than 15 years. I taught it a lot when I first started teaching. But one thing that I did was I had them read Ibn Battuta's travel journey and write a paper about it. Mike and I are often on the same wavelength. And so that was really important. What I tried to do in the first half of the survey, kind of looking back from Abu Lughod, was to think again about this decentering of Europe. So Europe was much more peripheral in the first half of my survey as students learned about these other places that had been wealthier before this contingent shift. But also answering Thomas Green's question, it doesn't quite get at the fact that there's less written material from other places, but when I used to teach the first half of the survey to make it more relevant, I just leaned very heavily on primary sources. I do that in the second half too, but really the purpose is for students to just understand that we're looking at the story of human beings and that they're thinking about similar things, coming back to the question that Mona had posed, how societies thought about gender in the past, how they dealt with people from different cultures, which is obviously still relevant. And so I tried to take those themes that were relevant and look backward.
I want to come back to the gender question next and read it and answer it in its own regard. I'm glad you made that bridge. But before we do, I just want to note, so Shane asked me if we can just, redirect this question back to the Americas a little bit. Many of us are Californian. We live in a state that's almost 50% Latinx students. This is for Alyssa. This is, a particular opportunity for you. But other than the Maya, we have nothing except archaeology until the Columbian Exchange. So is there something that can be done, especially given that history seems to insist on written evidence?
So again, I'll jump in just quickly. Well, we're flying so fast still in world history, so I don't have that much time. Before then, I'm moving forward. But one of the things that I try to pair, certainly with documents by Las Casas or Sepulveda, is these documents that Sahagún had gathered that supposedly give us Nahua perspectives on the conquest. So I'm always trying to show students as much as I can different perspectives while understanding that those were transcribed by a Spaniard. And the primary source reader that I've always used for both halves is Andrian Overfield, The Human Record. There are definitely things I have to supplement, but that's really helped with both of my halves.
Thanks, Alyssa. I want to move on to the question that Monica Siegel asked earlier, and that was also seconded by some other folks, which is how you integrate women and gendered history into your world history classes, and perhaps even how you gender those classes so that no matter what topic you're addressing, it's gendered. I'll throw it open to anyone on the panel.
I just talked, so does someone want to go ahead of me? Otherwise, I'll answer this and then someone can chime in. All right. So, Mona, that's a wonderful question. And this is, of course, the challenge in world history when you're flying so much. So I'd say that I have upper division classes where I do a much better job of building things around gender and integrating it. I'm going to pull up my syllabus for a second, and I'll just show you one way I've done it. It's not perfect. I try to bring up gender as we're going along, but I end up having 2 workshops, active learning primary source workshops, where the day is not a combination lecture and sources, it's comparing sources together as a class. So let me start then. Let's see, this is, okay. So this is one version of my syllabus. This is from before COVID. And I said that I would go through very quickly through my themes. So I've got the background: before the 15th century, Europe discovers the world, slavery, the Atlantic system in Africa, the Ottomans. And then I get to this part where I do cultural comparison and world history, gender as a case study. And I've got this document that is from the Netherlands, and then I've got a document from the Ottoman Empire, and then I've got a document from Japan. And then after I go through land empires, this is my boutique lecture. Probably a lot of people don't give a whole lecture on the Enlightenment, but I explain why I'm doing that. Atlantic revolutions, industrialization, nationalism, imperialism, the world wars. And then I get back, it just depends some days with how many days I have with vacations, but we come back to this whole collection of documents from around the world from the 1900s and 1910s that are looking at gender again. So that's just one thing that I do, but it's not ideal.
Thanks, Alyssa. Anybody else want to take this on? Mike, I see your hand.
So to be totally honest, I find it easier the closer I get to the 20th century, and then as I get into the 20th century, to work in meaningful gender analysis. I have a couple of things I do in the early section of world history, you know, look at Athenian women versus Spartan women. And I'm really feeling those things are a little cliched, a little stale. I mean, they're a good start. In the 20th century, which is my area of expertise, much more comfortable there, and just working gender in as, you know, the useful category of analysis. So it's always a part of any discussion of the significant events like World War I. How does that impact French men versus French women? And foreground that the different gendered experience of that war. Again, sort of factor that, foreground that, and make that one of the sort of the main analytical points that we keep coming back to. Did a World War II, what have you? How, you know, what's the experience of white women and non-white women in the era of high imperialism, and giving that equal weight. Again, I feel so much more comfortable doing that when I'm in comfortable ground. And I really love to hear suggestions from the panel or anybody on how to do that in the classical world, in the ancient world.
You know, what I've done in the first part of the Western Civ survey, at least, to further incorporate women's history and issues of gender and identity, is I try to make it a theme in almost every single week that we're doing. So not something that I kind of just like throw in here and there. that leads all the way from the first survey through the second one. For instance, something you mentioned, the Athenian and the Spartan thing, which I think a lot of people have done, but and I think it's useful. I find it useful myself. But what I start by doing is I, for instance, have students read a couple pages from Sarah Pomeroy's Goddesses, Whores, Wives, and Slaves. And they read about the different ways that historians have explained gender in ancient Greece and women's history in ancient Greece. So I get them kind of thinking that like some of this stuff has changed in the historiography. And then they read Aristotle discussing women, and then him discussing Spartan women. And then they read Xenophon discussing women, and they read Plutarch, and like they read like a whole variety of primary sources. Of course, the hard part is that most of these come from a male perspective, but you know, there's of course Sappho, if we can incorporate that as well. But when we're talking about Athens and Sparta, to get them to start kind of with the, I tell them that historians have looked really hard at this stuff, like frame it in historiography, then the students look at those primary sources, and then I have them kind of write papers about what they understand to be women's roles and places in these kind of ancient societies. And we kind of carry that through and like into the various weeks that we're doing. So by the time we get later in the semester, I feel like they're just kind of conditioned to always kind of be thinking about these things. So I've had a lot of professors as an undergrad and in grad school that really stress some of these issues. So I think it's become kind of embedded in what I do.
Thank you. I want to move on to Hans Dorr, who asked, is anyone using a more of a case study approach in history? And I want to bring it together with Thomas Green, who said, in this discussion, I'd like to hear more about the uncoverage case study, make it local approach as applied to the first half of the world history sequence. He loves that approach, but without a world system, which is what we often use to connect these things in the second half, how can those of us who teach the pre-1500 material adopt that approach? And I'm hoping as the four of you think about this, you'll think about this underlying question that folks are asking, which is about the nature of the class. I mean, our esteemed president doesn't like it to be called the survey, the freshman class, and there's a reason for that. It might be something very different. So I'd love to hear your responses to their questions.
Well, in the first half, my approach is much more case studies, and I really do, the first half of the World History Survey, I really do comparative history. And as we get towards the end, we start getting into patterns of globalization. The second half of the World History Survey really is a story of globalization. So the case studies are really significant in the first half.
Mike, but when you do that, I'm sorry to chime in. I mean, I guess the question is, I mean, there was a philosophy when the idea of a world history survey was put forward, right? And it was a philosophy of understanding change over time through networks and connections at sort of this broad scale. And when we move into a case study, which many people know, I've been a proponent of the case study approach, when the case study can do this uncoverage work of having students dive deep, it's fantastic. But then you do sort of sacrifice the coherence of a big narrative. And why is that cost worth bearing, I guess, is part of the implied question here.
The cost of sacrificing the big narrative?
Yeah, the cost of sacrificing the big narrative that only world history can tell, you know?
Yeah. Don't have a good answer for that, Trevor.
Well, none of us do, but you know, I think that's part of the reason why Hans and Thomas and others are bringing up this question, is because we're all thinking through, how do I balance this need to deep dive with this, you know, acknowledgement of the sort of bigger picture job that world history does.
Well, just very quickly, one of the things I do is I explain to the students in the first half of our that survey that we're looking at much more of a case study, comparative history approach, and then as we move towards globalization. So I problematize that history of globalization, that there is a history there, and it's something that's going to be built over time.
Yeah, there's some fantastic stuff in the chat right now about this. It's really rich. But Alyssa, I think you had a comment.
I'll just very quickly, I'll say Beth Pollard pointed out that there are these world systems before 1500. And I know that Ross Dunn is here. So I'll say again, even though I haven't taught the first half in a long time. Hi, Ross. When I was first an assistant professor preparing my class, I looked at the world history standards that he and others had created, and they gave me a framework to think about some of these things, even if, again, the Americas don't always follow, and that's a weakness of doing it that way. Certainly in Afurasia, there's lots of long distance trade and cross-cultural contact, and so I tried to build that into.
Thanks, Alyssa. And I think we can all agree that, world history for us all, which is largely Ross's initiative with some others, really walks that line of moving between scales. I mean, I was just looking at it yesterday, moving between scales, going deep, et cetera, while still having kind of a big narrative. It's a hard line to walk, though. I wanted to bring in a couple of other questions that I have in here before we run out of time. One was Yari Felber-Siegelman, I apologize, which is a really practical question that many of us, I think, especially several of us are at CSUs, we see this problem, which is that the World History Survey is usually taught by lecturers who don't have time to do professional development, who don't have incentive to do professional development. I mentioned in the chat one group that does pay people to rework some of their curriculum over the summer, for example. But what do you do with the fact that this is a hard class to redo? Mark, I see your hand is up.
There we go. Okay. Well, I just want to point out the fact that especially for high school, people teaching at the high school level, and also adjuncts and also faculty that are teaching the survey to freshmen, that there is absolutely no time to develop their own case studies on an average way. They don't have the time, they're not being paid. I noticed Tom mentioned that much, rather. And World History Connected has literally dozens of introductions to articles which state a large premise or process in world history, and then supports it with a case study, and then in many cases have an appendix on how to use it. So I would recommend people Googling it a little. If one could hold up one's book, I'd like to hold up that particular resource. I'd also encourage people to submit articles on those issues, their solutions, and also their questions, so we can form forums and individual articles that try to address those questions, or ask other faculty that, people we know to contribute. So the idea of improving the delivery in the survey course on the one level is fantastically intellectual and necessary. And the other one, of course, is communicating it to students. And I think we don't have to reinvent the wheel for that. Certainly at World History Connected, occasionally the Journal of World History does a very good job of that. For someone who asked about the ancient world, we devoted an issue to the world history of the ancient world because it's one of the, because of new changes in curriculum, so little time is spent. And a very senior world historian, Stanley Burstein, wrote an article about war elephants. And actually what the article says is this exchange of military technology from South Asia to the Mediterranean and into sub-Saharan or North Africa, and then also, interestingly enough, to Southeast Asia in ways which reflect both the universality of war elephants, but more importantly, how the cultures that adopted the war elephants used them within their own cultural and intellectual environment, not just military, and extends it by the argument, by the way, to Southeast Asia. So that's easy enough to do. I know a lot of students who would love to just see war elephants and suddenly the bells go off, but I think it would be a great idea to look for those things because there's a search engine and you can, rather than spend time you really don't have. But I would encourage everyone to keep looking on their own. Anyway, thank you for the time to mention that.
Can I just say, I'm going to editorialize for one moment and just say, I like many of you, I don't see a solution until our academy moves away from an apartheid system of discrimination and underfunding for those who actually teach this kind of work.
Yeah, yeah.
Mike did raise his eyebrows a little bit when I used the word apartheid, but I've been using it to describe the segregation between tenure track and contingent faculty for a while. I think it fits actually. So yeah, so that was my editorializing. Brad Simpson had a question for Mike. Do you use other books, novels, or graphic novels, primary source collections for teaching about cities? I teach modern world history and teach the novel Dumb Luck. What other city-based books or novels do you find most teachable? And after Mike, maybe anybody else who has recommendations could weigh in as well.
Yeah, I picked out a quick answer in there. But first, Dumb Luck is absolutely fabulous. If anybody's teaching 20th century world and wants a great source, Peter Zinnemann's translation of Dumb Luck is amazing. It's readable. Students really love that book. It is super funny and so insightful in terms of cultural transformations. And it's all set in Hanoi, which I love. But one of the short stories I've had a lot of success with is a short one by Mas Marco, who was a Javanese PKI Communist Party member, journalist who got sent off to jail. I forget the exact title of it. It'll come to me in 10 minutes. And it's a great sort of window into, I think, the city of Semarang under Dutch colonial rule in the 20th century.
Brad said, is it called IMPKI?
No. I can find it in a second. And then I also really, for recent history, there's a novel by Hanif Kureishi, the filmmaker, novelist, playwright, about London in 1989 with the backdrop of both the Salman Rushdie affair and the Berlin Wall coming down and rave culture, that really does a great job of, and post-colonialism, really does a great job of bringing on all these sort of trends together that shows the end of the Cold War and the beginning of the end of history, and also engages with terrorism in a way that I found extremely useful in my classes. Hanif Kureishi's the Black Album is the title of that. And I think I can find the Mas Marco thing in a second. I'll yell it out.
Can I add two resources that I think are incredible and often overlooked? The first is Maurice Condé's Segu, S-E-G-U. I know it was written in 40 years ago, but it is a novel that is deeply researched, set in the interior of West Africa in the 18th and early 19th century, spanning before and during the Atlantic Age, which is great. The Africans in it are alive, living everyday lives, but also, doing incredible things. It goes, from Segu to Asante to Benin to Brazil. I think it's incredible. More recently, The 100 Wells of Salaga. And somebody is going to remind me the name of the author because it went for 1 second. Oh, Aisha Haruna Atta, The 100 Wells of Salaga. Another story, very gendered and very much about women, set in pre-colonial and taking pre-colonial Africans' lives, well researched, as of their own value. Never mind whether they're Europeans or not around, right? Jonathan Reynolds has put a couple of others in there as well. Boy, Black Ass is just a brilliant book, I've got to say, that raises all kinds of great questions. So that's a good one, Jonathan. And so you have others, please do put them in the chat for each other as recommendations we can make for each other. Mike?
It's The Corrupted Life of a Big City by Mas Marco, and it's a short story. It's about 3-4 pages long. I put it into the Norton World History Mix when I worked on that a few years ago. You can also find it, I think it's in a Monash University anthology of work by Mas Marco.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists have recommendations of things, similar resources that can be inserted into classes, spend a little bit more time on, that we want to leave our colleagues with?
I had one other question I needed to answer from the chat, but I will wait on that.
No, please do it, Alyssa. Thank you.
Sam Routhier had asked, why do I give the day to the Enlightenment? And
yeah,
so,
bring it on.
okay, it is my argument that lecture is called Seeds of Change. And so I argue that even though those ideas are shared among a very small group of people in one part of the world, that they're going to end up driving a lot of processes. So certainly one of them is the idea of popular sovereignty, which is going to fuel revolutions in multiple parts of the world, and then also fuel anti-colonial activism. As people learn in the colonies that the founding documents in Paris might say all men are born and remain free and equal, but that's not being applied in Senegal or Algeria. And certainly a lot of other questions that are posed in terms of whether colonialism is good, whether spreading Christianity to others is good. I just think that there are a lot of ideas that then get picked up by people in other places. So that is my arguments for why that gets its own day.
I'm into it. When you go to like college professor history conferences, do people take issue with your decision to spend a full day on an Enlightenment lecture?
I think Bram was raising this issue before in the chat, is that our classes are going to look very different from each other's if we're able to spend time on them. That comes back again to the issue of whether lecturers have the same amount of time. But I think that the more, it's certainly, as I said, I think it's good to decenter Europe. So a class that's really Western Civ passing as world history, that I'm not going to give a thumbs up to just because someone's a European historian. But I think that sometimes if we have some space to talk about the things that we know the best and are most passionate about, that's communicating all of these wonderful things about history to our students more than when we're doing our best job on an area that's not our specialty. So that's just the one day that I can give them a really deep dive on this movement that I know a lot about, and to think about how it's going to affect people in other parts of the world.
The Enlightenment debate is continuing in the chat, and so both of you should feel free to go ahead and look at what Jonathan Reynolds, amongst others, put there. As a last moment, I see Mark's hand up. There was also a question for Mark. Mark, did you want to speak, or did you want me to bring up the question?
Yes, excellent. Well, actually, Mike Vann probably knows about it. One of the issues Anne raised, which of course was women. Another issue we haven't raised, which is mixed race. A lot of our students are interested in the problems of mixed race, which tie in, of course, into colonialism, of which there's a tremendous amount of literature. But Jack Yeager has done a translation of White Métis by Kim Lefevre. And it is an astounding piece of work, and there's a readily available literature. If anyone wants to contact me, I can show how it can be used in the classroom. But it's got a sex reasonable. It's not. I think it might be worth looking at.
Thank you, Mark. Mark, there was so if we can stick with you for a minute now, and
Sure.
shoot, everything has moved here, but Thomas Green had brought up a further question about, and Thomas, I've lost it. Oh, here, I'd like to bring Mark's assessment focus into this conversation more. We should also be thinking about innovative ways to assess. I use the unessay approach in other courses, but not yet in world history. What else can we do besides testing, quiz, essay, presentation? And, you know, I think that this is a really good question about, you know, there's a lot of debates about authentic and whether authentic and creative assessment does things better or not. But this will give you the last word, Mark. Any last thoughts on assessment before we break?
Well, I think the most important thing is student buy-in. Students have to believe that the assessment is really worthwhile, that it really measures what they're learning, and where they fail, an instructor can point out what they need to do in terms of critical thinking. And I think without that, whatever system we use, without that, it's not going to be as successful as it could be.
Thank you, Mark. I'd like to thank everybody here. I'd like to thank the World History Association for organizing this. Thank the AHA for recording and keeping it as part of their workshop, ongoing workshop as well. I'd like to thank the 4 panelists who have been fantastic, the folks at the WHA who put in the labor, and all of you for your contributions as well. Thank you, everybody. I hope this conversation, this lively conversation, continues. The last word goes to Laura Mitchell, I think.
Yeah, Trevor, thank you so much for handing the floor back. And thank you to all of the panelists for a really stimulating conversation, and equally to everyone who chimed in with questions. This has been a really robust chat. I have been copying and pasting and taking my own notes. It's a really generative conversation about how we think, right? Because this is what teaching is. It's thinking, it's intellectual work, it is problem solving on the highest order. And one of the things that I really appreciate about this conversation in particular is the wide range of questions without an attempt at finding a single answer. And Bram's comment's already been brought up, but I want to reemphasize that there's no single answer that's going to work for every instructor and for every teaching context with every student body. And I'm really impressed at how many of these comments started student-centered. Where are our students and what do those students need? And what's the context that we can bring as instructors to help them get where they need to go? We're not going to solve questions about the trade-offs between having a strong narrative through line and pausing to do deep dives and case studies. How you decide to do that for your students and for your intellectual problem solving is going to be different than how I or anyone else decide that as an instructor. These questions about uncoverage, which continue to percolate through the discipline, and I think remain so generative. Looking forward to more conversation about that. I want to thank everyone again for participating in Under the Baobab, and to reiterate my thanks to Trevor, to Getz, Alyssa Steppenwall, Mike Vann, Tony Acevedo, and Mark Gilbert for sharing their time and expertise with us. And thanks very much to Carrie Vieira and Luke Scalone, who have been working very hard in the background to make this whole thing work and all of us get together. I'm very grateful for them. One last note before we chime off, the next WHA event is the World History Association of Texas regional meeting on February 20th around a world of things: consumerism, consumption, and commodities. So lots more grist for the world history teaching mill. So I invite you to stay connected for more information about this with the WHA through social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please look us up and please come back for our next gathering under the Baobab. Bye, y'all.